Hi, I'm Danιέλem Negrяnu, and welcome to the Stacked Poker School. The first thing we need to think about when playing Texas Hold'em are what hands we should play and what hands to throw away. In the next few sections, I'm going to get into specific detail about what hands you should play in what positions. Throughout the poker school, you're going to hear me throw around the term position quite a bit. Now, there are three positions at the table: early, middle, and late. The first three seats are generally considered early position. Then we have middle position, and the button and the two seats directly to the right of the button would be considered late position. Well, the first group of hands that we're going to look at are big pairs and ace-king suited. Now, obviously, you're going to play one of these hands in any one of the positions. But in early position, it's really important to make sure that you're raising to try to limit the field a little bit. You don't want to play two kings against four players. Now, moving on to middle position, if you've already had some action in front of you, again, it's important to raise, but you should be raising a little more to protect your hand. Now, in late position, this is the best possible spot you could be in. You've already seen all the action in front of you. You're going to get to act last on every single street, which is a huge benefit in Texas Hold'em. Now, again, with one of these hands, you should raise. So in all three situations, you should basically be raising with these hands. Since they're so good, you want to put more money in the pot. Now, with hands like King-Jack offsuit or Queen-10 offsuit, those are both decent hands. The problem with those hands come into play when you flop top pair with a weak kicker. Let's say, for example, you had King-Jack, which is what I like to call the rookie hand, and the flop comes King-4-5. Well, if you catch that king on the flop, you're going to be sucked into the river. And if somebody has a better kicker than you, ace-king or king-queen, you're just going to be losing a lot of money with that hand. Probably the trickiest hands to play are those pesky middle pairs. I'm talking about jacks, 10s, 9s, and even 8s, really. Now, from early position, there's a couple ways you can approach it. Limping is sort of a cautious way to see what happens behind you, but generally, it goes along with my style. It would be to raise with these hands and try to sort of isolate and maybe play it against one opponent. Now, for middle position, it would depend on what happened ahead of you. If nobody's raised yet, well, again, you'd play just like you would in early position, and you'd raise. However, if somebody's already raised in front of you and you're looking down at 2 8s, I don't know. If the guy's raising from early position, chances are he's got a real good hand. With 8s, I think I would just call there and see a flop. If you catch an 8, now we've got a real hand. From late position, if nobody's entered the pot yet, this is a perfect kind of hand you want to attack the blinds with by making a raise. However, again, if there's a raise in front of you, I just call. Now, if you're facing a raise and a re-raise, well, how can 2 8s or 2 9s be good? That's a time to save some money, throw it away, and don't find yourself in a bad spot with 8s up against a bigger pair like queens or kings. You need to be really careful when you're playing small pairs. In early position, I advise just limping in and trying to see the flop cheaply. Now, you could fold, and that's probably what the books would tell you to do. The other option would be to raise. And now I'd only recommend raising if you feel like you've got command of the table and that the blinds are really on the conservative side. Now, for middle position, if nobody's entered the pot yet, lean towards raising and trying to attack the blinds. However, if there's already been some limpers, well, then you can limp along as well and try to see a cheap flop. Now, if there's been a raise already, if it's a small raise, maybe you can see a flop and try to flop a set. Now, from late position, this is ideal. If nobody's entered the pot, definitely you want to raise it up and attack the blinds. However, again, if there's been a small raise or some limpers, you can see a flop. There's nothing sweeter than calling with 2 4s against an early position raise who's got 2 aces and the flop coming Queen 6-4. He bets it, you move all in, and he walks home with a story to tell. Suited connectors. Now we're getting into the fun stuff. If you play these hands correctly, you can win yourself a lot of money. From early position, with a short stack, you just got to throw it away. If you had a big stack, though, you might be able to throw in a small raise for deceptive purposes. Now, in middle position, if you're facing a raise, it depends how big the raise is in relation to your stack size. If the raise is too big, well, you just can't play. However, if nobody's played, you can come in with a raise and go after the blinds. In late position, now this is where it gets fun. If there's a couple limpers, you go ahead and limp right along. If everyone's folded around to you, again, you go and raise to attack the blinds. But here, if an early position player raises and you think they might have aces or kings, this is perfect if you have a hand like 5, 7 of diamonds. He has aces, so what? If you hit your flop, you've got him right where you want him. Think about it. Say you flop it straight. He bets, you raise, he sticks it all in. You're like, sweet, I got the nuts straight. He's got a story to tell his buddies about how bad you play. So the bottom line with suited connectors is it's really all about implied odds. Think of it like fishing. You're throwing out the bait, and then really what you're trying to do is reel in a big sucker if you hit a good flop. Poker's all about getting the best of it. It's about making correct decisions and good bets. Let's take this coin, for example. The odds of it hitting heads or tails are 50-50. What if I told you I put up $300 to your $100 that it comes heads? Well, that seems like a good bet for you. Conversely, if I said I'll put up $300 but you have to put up $1,000, well, that doesn't seem like such a good bet for you anymore. In poker, pot odds are the exact same principle as flipping this coin. When it comes to pot odds, the first thing you need to think about is what price the pot is laying you. Let's look at an easy example. Let's say there's 500 in the pot already, and your opponent's bet 100. Well, count that up. There's 600 there. How much do you have to call? 100. So what are the odds? 6-1. Now, once you've figured out what price the pot is laying you, it's important to understand what the odds of you actually making your hand is. So let's look at an example. Let's say you had a flush draw and there's one card to come. Well, we know 6 cards, which leaves 44 remaining unseen cards. Well, there's 9 spades that could help you, meaning there's 9 good cards and 35 bad cards. So that right there is right around 4-1 odds. If the pot is laying you more than 4-1 odds, well then you're getting the right price. If the pot's only laying you, for example, 2-1 odds, well, then you'd have to throw it away. Okay, well certainly the mathematics behind Hold'em are extremely important. You know, understanding pot odds, starting position, and all the other aspects of the game. But realistically, what it all boils down to is the way you read your opponents. What we're going to look at now are some of the various opponents you're going to face in the game. Playing against amateurs is where you're going to make the brunt of your money. I mean, these guys don't know what they're doing. They're playing all sorts of hands they shouldn't be playing, calling all kinds of bets they definitely shouldn't be calling. So the thing to think about when playing these amateurs is because they're calling stations, you don't want to bluff them. If you start bluffing amateurs, then you become an amateur, really. Now the rocks just play super tight. When you're up against a rock, they're always in there with a premium hand. And whenever they bet at you, they pretty much always got the nuts. So how do you defend against that? It's pretty easy, really. If a rock ever bets at you, just throw your hand away. You want to avoid marginal situations. Also, when it's a rock that's in the blind, you should go ahead and raise it up. The guy's never going to play unless he has the absolute nuts. Rocks do really well against amateurs, and they do well against maniacs. But as a pro, you can exploit a rock really easily. Now, when you're up against a maniac, you really have to have your seatbelt on. I mean, these guys are nuts. They're always betting, raising, re-raising, bluffing, with all kinds of weird hands. So the way to defend against that is you really got to set traps for them. Let them bluff their money off and milk them all the way to the river. Set traps, that's the key. The problem is, for a pro, maniacs can often be a thorn in your side. The maniacs do really poorly against the rocks, and they do poorly against the amateurs, but they can often take a pro down. When you're up against a pro, you better bring your A game. Pros aren't easily predictable. They mix up their game really well. Sometimes they're bluffing, sometimes they're playing the nuts. They're always constantly changing gears at will. So why bother pick on a pro when you have other opportunities to beat up on the weak players? Stick to beating up on the amateurs and the rocks. The only time you should face off against a pro is when you've got a really strong hand yourself. Everybody always wants to know, how do you read your opponents? Well, reading your opponents isn't easy. It's both an art and a science. There's really 2 approaches, or 2 things you can combine to help you read opponents. The first thing being physical tells, looking for mannerisms and trying to pick up on maybe facial tics and things. But realistically, looking to see how somebody twists their cookie, that's not going to get it done. What's more reliable is to focus on your opponent's betting patterns, how they bet their hands, and past betting history. So while physical tells aren't the be-all, end-all of reading your opponents, there's still a few things that you should look for that'll really help you out in a key pot. For one, if you notice that a player is betting really aggressively, and all of a sudden his arm extends like that, like, I bet! Well, chances are, this guy's trying to scare you. He might be bluffing. Conversely, if you notice that a person's betting, I bet, you're real careful, well, he's inviting you in. He's like, come on in, I gotcha. Which leads me to the next example, and that's the sigh. If you notice a guy go like this when he sees an ace on the flop and says, chances are, that's some bad acting right there. He loves that board, and he's just trying to fake a tell. Which brings me to the last thing. Once you've coined, and once you know that your opponent is using fake tells, look for stuff like that. If you see that he looks at the board and goes, you know what that means? That means he loves what he sees there. Once an actor, always an actor. Once a bad actor, always a sucker. You'll often hear people on TV say things like, I can see through his soul. Like, give me a break. No, you can't. The truth is, the great players are great. Why? Because they focus on betting patterns. They focus on the action, the pre-flop action, flop action, how does this person play these hands in certain positions? Does this person raise with a flush draw? Would this person ever just call with a big pair like aces or kings? The more questions you ask yourself and the more answers you get, the higher the likelihood that you're going to make the right decision in the long run. So again, to improve your hand reading skills, you need to combine both the art and the science, both the physical mannerisms as well as your opponent's betting patterns. You really just got to pay attention, watch your opponents. The more information you have, the better decisions you'll be able to make in those big crucial pots. If you ask world champion Carlos Mortensen, he'll probably tell you, poker is all about the bluffing. Well, while bluffing is definitely an integral part of your overall strategy, that's not all there is to it. First of all, you got to figure out, who do you bluff? Think about that for a second. How you can bluff an amateur? An amateur doesn't even know what he has, let alone he's going to try to figure out what you've got now. How about the maniac? You don't want to get involved with these guys. You trap maniacs. You don't try to bluff them. The guys you want to bluff are the rocks, the weak and the timid. There's more than one way to bluff. You can try a desperate, stone-cold bluff on the river when you've got absolutely no hand. Or you can use a trick that the pros like to use, called the semi-bluff. Think about it for a second. Let's say you have 2 hearts in your hand. 2 hearts come out on the board, giving you a flush draw. Well, that's a pretty strong hand. You're going to call a bet, right? Why not bet yourself? This gives you 2 ways to win. If you bet and nobody calls, you win the pot right there. If you bet and somebody does call, oh well, now it's just time to hit your flush and win an even bigger pot. I see far too many rookies throwing out that desperation bet on the river thinking that's the only way they can win. But that's not how you bluff. You gotta set up a bluff early in the hand. It's like telling a story. You don't just throw a bet out on the river with no rhyme or reason. You're telling a lie, you gotta tell it right. You know why position is so important in Texas Hold'em? I'll tell you why. Bluffing. When you get to see what your opponents do before you have to act, you get so much more information that you can use against them. Think about it. Your opponent checks, he's either trapping you or he's got nothing. It's your job to figure out which one it is. This is no time to get cute. There's too many people in the pot to try bluffing wildly when there's so many people that could hit the flop. Yeah, when you're up against one guy, sure you can bluff, especially if he checks to you. But with 4 guys in a pot, come on, man. You can't bluff everybody. So why would you ever show a bluff? I'll tell you why. There's nothing sweeter than taking a pot off a guy with absolute rags and then showing it to him as he throws his hand in the muck. It'll send him on complete tilt for the rest of the session. And everybody else at the table, they'll get to see that you're willing to bluff, you might have the nuts, they'll never be able to figure you out. You know, it's funny. Sometimes the absolute correct strategy for no limit hold'em is the exact opposite of what the correct strategy would be in limit hold'em. Let's take a look at a few examples. Probably the biggest difference between no limit and limit hold'em is the way you approach playing on the flop. Now in limit hold'em, it's all about pound, pound, pound. Let's say for example, you have ace jack and the flop comes jack 9-4. Well, in limit hold'em, you want to bet and raise and re-raise as much as possible. But if you're playing no limit hold'em, it's a little more tricky. You only got 1 pair. Sure, it's top pair, but if somebody else has a set, you could lose everything you have. So in no limit, you want to be more cautious and look to trap. In limit hold'em, when you get to the river, it's totally okay to stay aggressive. If you think you have the best hand, go ahead and bet one more time. What's the worst thing that can happen? You lose 1 more bet. Big deal. It's not the end of the world. But in no limit hold'em, it just might be. In no limit hold'em, even if you think you have the best hand sometimes, if a really scary card comes off and it might cost you your entire stack, sometimes it's better to just check and win what's already in the middle. Limit hold'em has often been described as a science, while no limit hold'em is often considered an art form. See, the problem with bluffing in limit hold'em is you just can't put enough pressure on your opponents with 1 stinking bet. However, in no limit hold'em, if you think your opponent's weak, you can bet it all if you want. Now that ought to scare them. In a live game, all you have to worry about is playing your hands right and maximizing your profit. But in a tournament, you often have to sacrifice value in order to survive. Tournament poker is more about survival and money management skills than it is getting full value on your hands. There are mixed theories on how to approach the early stages of a tournament. The best approach, though, is to take calculated risks and really go after those dead money players. There's more bad players in the early stages of the tournament, and if you don't get that dead money, one of the other top players will. The middle stages of a tournament are really tough. Your strategy depends on your table composition. If you're at a table with a bunch of weak and timid players, well then you be a maniac and start attacking them. However, if there's already a bunch of maniacs at your table, well then you need to be patient. Sit back and look to trap them. It's all about ebb and flow. Okay, now this is the stage that separates the men from the boys. What you want to do now is get super aggressive, especially against the wimpy players who aren't looking to play and just squeak into the money. The real champions at this stage live by a philosophy. It's real simple. In order to survive, you must be willing to die.